What's up guys, Anthony Cordova here, and in today's video I'm showing you everything I know about Bondo or body filler, whatever you want to call it. I know it's not called Bondo, I know it's called body filler, so don't come for me in the comments. Bondo was made popular back in the 50s because it was the first brand that came out and was popularized by the mainstream. I know that this is a one step in restoring a car that a lot of people struggle with. If you're a do-it-yourselfer and you were ever interested in learning how to use Bondo or body filler, stick with me because I'm going to go through and show you everything that I know about Bondo. Here I'm getting my mask on so that I can start sanding this epoxy primer with 80 grit on a dual action sander so that I can get a nice mechanical etch on that primer so that I won't have a problem with the body filler coming up or delaminating from that surface. If you follow along on my 58 build, I am restoring a 1958 convertible. I recently got all the floor pans installed and I am sanding around the welded seams so that I can put the body filler over the top of that so that it looks like it's seamless. I will also go around and with some 80 grit by hand, I will hand sand all the creases and crevices so that I make sure that that filler is able to stick very well to that surface. Here I'm checking to see the sanded areas, any shiny areas like there that I'm pointing at. I am getting in with the edge of the sandpaper and I'm sanding those areas so that I know 100% that that filler or Bondo is going to stick well, and I'm not going to have an issue with delamination or the filler coming up from that surface or failing. As you can see here, like I said, I'm getting in there with my finger and just getting all those little creases and crevices where the machine sander won't get. Here you can see I'm mixing my filler, and this is a combination of body filler, some thinner glaze as they call it, but basically glaze is a thinner body filler material that you use for the final coat to fill any pinholes or any small imperfections. I mix those two together to make the body filler a little smoother, and also I put a little small ribbon of hardener to activate that body filler. The initial first coat I'm putting on a little thicker than the last coats. You'll progressively make the coats thinner, but here I'm just covering the bigger imperfections or the bigger or deeper low areas first. And I don't care what body filler you buy. I've purchased the $100 body fillers by 3M that are super expensive. This here is called Z-Grip by Evercoat. It's called Z-Grip because it has zinc in it, and it's supposedly made to hold off corrosion better. But I've always liked the way it sands and it spreads. And I'm also tapering off the edges. I'm not just putting on globs of filler and sanding. I'm making sure that I'm consciously tapering off the edges and spreading it to the shape that I want. Here I'm checking to see my tackiness. So if there's a stickiness to the filler, You don't want to sand yet, but you do want to get this filler when it's still a little bit soft and not fully hardened. That's a trick that professionals use to move through working this filler properly, is checking to see the tackiness or the stickiness of the surface, so that when you do sand it, it's still soft and not fully hardened, but not sticky so that it's going to clog up your sandpaper. Now here it's ready, and I'm going in with some 80 grit by hand on a block, and I'm just hitting that top surface. And here I'm showing you that the filler isn't sticking or clogging up that sandpaper. It's good enough to sand right at this point. It's still a little soft where it's not fully hardened, but it's not sticky, so it's not clogging up my sandpaper. I'll go in here and get that top layer sanded, and then I'll come back with my dual action sander and start to give this thing a nice shape. And if you notice here, I'm going around the edges first and feathering all those edges in so that I'm getting a good read on this filler. I'm making sure all the edges are nice and sanded around where I put that filler, and taper those off first and then go in and give this filler some shape. Like I said, I'm not just globbing on this filler. I've seen a lot of guys, they have trouble with filler because they put a bunch on and don't initially, when they spread it, start to give this thing a shape or start to give a shape to your work area. I'm using a X pattern. A lot of this, when you sand body filler, you have to give it sort of an X pattern and not so much a straight side to side pattern when you're sanding. Here I'm going around and tapping down any little high spots or areas that the metal is poking through where I want it to go down. And I'm not hitting it very hard. I'm just kind of giving it some pecks so that I know when I go to put on my second or third coat of filler that those spots will be level or a little bit lower than my initial coat of filler, and they'll be covered. Your coats should progressively get thinner. And how they get thinner is by putting a little bit more pressure on your spatula or your spreader, as they call it. Your last third or fourth coat should almost be see-through. On some areas here, you can see that some of it is see-through. You're going to get pinholes. It's just going to happen. I've used the expensive body fillers and it makes no difference. The way you fix those pinholes is by using a glaze coat on your final coat, putting a glaze over all this body filler and covering any pinholes or small imperfections. I'm also going around with my smaller dual action sander. This has a 2-inch pad on it, and I'm going around and I'm just getting in all those areas or giving some nice shape to those tighter areas where I can't fit my bigger dual action sander with the 6-inch pad on. And when I'm doing these round shapes, I'm doing an X pattern. So I'm going diagonal to the right and then diagonal to the left. There I'm feeling how it feels. That's how you tell your imperfections or where you need more sanding or where you need more filler, is by using your hand and getting familiar with the way the surface feels. Your hands are your eyes in this case. I'm blending everything together here. Everything is finished in 180 grit so that you're not just piling on the primer. This thing should take 3 coats of primer and be able to sand and paint after this is all done. I covered all the pitting from the existing corrosion. I did use some phosphoric acid on this prior to putting the epoxy primer, so it's all protected, and spraying a good amount of epoxy primer over this metal so that it's protected and the rust doesn't come back. And then I put the body filler over that. Anywhere that there's seams that I want to make it seamless, I'm covering. This is straight glaze. As you can see, it's a lot thinner than regular body filler, and I'm using this to fill all the small imperfections anywhere that it doesn't need a bunch of body filler. I'm using this glaze. This is how you get those pinholes out. And you can see that this glaze is almost see-through, so that I can just hit it with some 80 grit on a dual action sander really quick, and then come back with a 180 grit and do the final finish on this so that the primer just goes on nice and easy. And I'm not trying to use primer to fix any imperfections. Here, where I can't get with the spreader, I'm going in with my finger and just giving it a quick coat with my finger in the back of that seat bracket there. And I'm still feathering the edges with my finger by smashing down a little harder on the edges. Here I'm moving to the underside to fix this rear seat pan on this 1958 convertible. I put a patch right there where I'm going to put this filler on, and that is just straight Z-grip body filler right there to fill the bigger imperfections. And as you can see, I'm doing sort of a figure 8 pattern, getting everything to the middle of that panel, that mixing board. Then I'm smashing down, trying to get any air pockets out of that filler. Going around, filling the bigger imperfections first. On this particular piece here, I strategically placed my welds on the edges so that I know that I can just go around those edges with body filler and make a nice shape, and I'm not battling a welded seam on these welded panels. I'm tapering off any edges, giving some shape to this body filler ahead of time so that I'm not having to sand for hours. When it starts getting hard or catalyzing, you can see here I just stop. Clean my filler board, my mixing board, and sand and start over. There's no sense in ruining your good spread with hardened body filler. As soon as it starts catalyzing or getting hard, just stop and move on. And again, I'm going around with my dual action sander and by hand to get all that filler into a nice shape where it's nice and even, going in and getting all those creases and crevices by hand. This is just the underside, so it doesn't have to be perfect, but you want a nice, decent looking level surface so that your seams look seamless. That's the whole idea of doing a repair on one of these classic cars. So after 80, I'll go ahead and switch over to 180, which is this row right here. And I'll go ahead and take all the 80 grit scratches out. Try to stay away from this areas that are high as much as possible. If I have to bury those in primer, no big deal. I'm not too worried about this thing being a little wavy or having little dimples here and there, not a big deal.
So on this here, the weld went right along that edge right there. And I kind of just strategically place my weld right in that edge because I know I can make the edge a little bit rounder or higher if I need to, and kind of just feather it over this other edge on this other side, and then blend all this in. And then when I come back to prep it for primer, I'll make sure that I get all these 80 scratches, all that are out here, all out, all over here, and make sure this is all 180 from the filler to the primer, all in 180, so that I don't have to come in here and just try to drown this thing in primer, and you're not just building a bunch of material that you don't need. And then I'll come in with 320, sand the whole thing, seal it, and paint it, call it done. I don't know if you can tell or not in the camera, but all this area is brushed on with these synthetic horsehair brushes. I use these to brush on glazing putty, and that's perfectly acceptable when it comes to doing these smaller areas and these pinch welds where you want to make all that area nice and smooth. With these cars and certain angles, sometimes you're in a weird angle, so these brushes also help for those weird angles where it's just easier to put a nice flowing coat on there and then come back with some 80 grit and sand all that nice and smooth. For this, because it dries really fast, you have to work small amounts at a time. So that's how much I'm working right now, and I'll still end up with a little residual because it's going to get hard really fast. And again, even with the brush, I'm feathering the edges a little bit so I don't have a hard edge right there that I have to sand away and make this thing feel all weird. These don't have to be perfect, but we want them nice. Give it that back and forth. Establish a nice little line there. Then X in a nice little pattern. Right here in this corner, you can go straight up and down. It's all about the X's. Give it a little flat, little X in there with your fingers, 2 fingers as your block. Thumb in there in that bottom section. Make a little circle in there to dig out that corner. Maybe fold your paper in half. Give it a little X in there. And X this side in. I like to clean these layers up just with a little pocket knife and some sandpaper as much as I can, and then just go in here with seam sealer. It looks more appropriate than having just a little bit of Bondo in that layer seam.
So here I'm on the rear seat pan again, and I'm establishing a body line on that edge of that seam that I welded where I had to make a patch panel for that rear seat pan. I'm using a little bit of body filler, but mostly catalyzed glazing putty in this situation, making sure I'm getting all that hardener mixed together so that I have no inconsistencies. And in here you can just go in and build up a nice little edge. I'm pushing up and then tapering down, pushing up then tapering down to get more of that filler on the top edge. Then I'll come in with a little diagonal pull and load that top side of that edge. Remember, if it's hot, especially because it was hot this day, you have to work fast with this glazing putty because it is thinner and it dries really fast. So I'll work it until it dries, but once it dries, I stop because you don't want to mess up your nice spread. I'll go in here one last time and I'll push some filler up towards the edge, keep pushing it up towards the edge, get around that corner on that side, and then give it one final shape. Here it's getting ready to dry. I can see it starting to kick off. You see it start to like not be smooth anymore. You can see it right there. It's starting to kick off. So I'll just taper off my edges and be done. Testing for tackiness. And I'll come in with 80 on the block and establish a nice body line there. Making sure my strokes are nice and even. Here I'm tapering off the outside edge a little bit. Getting this all blended together. You have to get good at angling your sanding block and giving different angles so that you can sand different areas, especially on these body lines that have 2 or 3 edges. Then I'll come back and establish the top line. And I'm making sure not to get too into the existing filler that was already there. I'm just kind of lightly gliding over it so that I don't make another low spot in the filler that was already there. I'm just mainly staying on this edge and trying to get a nice little body line established here. Making sure everything's blended together with the 80, so I can come in here with 180 and finish this section off. Cleaning it off so that I can spray some guide coat on there. So this isn't really guide coat. Usually guide coat is black, but I didn't have any and I didn't want to stop and go to the store, so I just got some etching primer and got a nice line painted on there so that I can use that as a visual reference to make a nice crisp body line. And you can see one side's done with 180. This is 180 grit here, and I'm getting rid of all those sand scratches from the 80 grit. And at the same time, I'm establishing a nice body line there with 180. Making sure that I'm not interfering or getting too far into the other filler, but just blending it all in. Always use guide coat. A lot of people like to use tape. I don't like using tape because tape won't show you your sand scratches that you need to get out. And I like to make sure that I have all my 80 grit sand scratches out so that I'm not having to put a bunch of primer on this thing. Just 3 coats and done. Now blending everything together here, giving it one final, and you can see that edge is starting to crisp up really nice right there. Here I just put some wax and grease remover on so you can kind of see the edge a little bit better. Well guys, that's going to do it for this edition of how to use body filler or Bondo. I wanted to make this video because I am really efficient and good at using body filler. I've done it for over 30 years. I've perfected my craft when it comes to using body filler, and I figured that I can help some of you guys out by giving you some tips and showing you some tricks as well on things that you can do or procedures you can use to be better at using body filler. I know getting good at it won't happen overnight, but you have to start somewhere. And if you're a do-it-yourselfer or you're getting into restoring classics, you're gonna need to figure out how to use filler, or even just doing collision repair. You're gonna need to use filler for certain repairs. I came up in an era where we fixed a lot of stuff. Now, panel replacement is big when you work in a big body shop or a collision repair shop. so you don't use as much body filler, but still you will have to use some. Nowadays, if a quarter panel is wrecked bad enough, they'll just replace it. But back in the day, the old time guys that I learned from would repair a quarter panel as opposed to just replacing it. They would go in there and pull the big dents out and sit there and peck and file and peck and take out dents and take out waves, and then spread the whole quarter with filler and just shape it all out. And that's how I learned. So that's how I got really good at doing filler. So I hope that I helped you or brought you some value. If I did, an easy way to support the channel is to go ahead and hit the subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell so you can be notified whenever I drop new videos. This wraps up this video, and I'll catch you on the next one. All right.